Today, a presentation from Professor Deflem. The title is Democracy and the Sociology of Law, the View from the United States. Please give a big hands.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you for everybody for being here. That's really awesome. As you will know, there is a lot going on in the United States presently when it comes to democracy and law. I speak from the viewpoint of the role of democracy in the sociological study of law. The general conclusion is that there's a lot of sociology of law. There is very little talk about democracy in sociology of law in the United States and in modern sociology in general. So I'm going to develop a little bit of a perspective, and then I will do two applications on the role of law in certain issues that have to do with democracy currently. I focus on procedural aspects of law and democracy, particularly in terms of law itself also as an ongoing activity. Then I also use, but in a somewhat ironic sense, an important article that was written in the 1970s by Austin Turk, and he talks about law as a weapon in conflict, which is very counterintuitive to our everyday understanding of law, because we tend to think of law as conflict resolution. And nowadays, we use the expression of lawfare. But lawfare was traditionally used as the use of law in autocratic regimes. Right? That's not what this is. This is a new understanding of lawfare, whereby law is a tool, a weapon that can be used by a lot of people. So it is a translation, typically, of a cultural conflict in a legal arena. And that is actually the notion that I'm going to rely on to talk to you about some of the things that are going on in the United States today. So when it comes to law and democratic governance, obviously a lot of the lawfare revolves around presidential candidates, and particularly former President Donald Trump. When it comes to law and anti-Semitism, I think we're right now in the United States engaged in a very important and very problematic dimension of democracy in the United States. We can talk about the use of law as a weapon in the run-up to the presidential elections, which will be in November. Because obviously a lot of these discussions are political, right? They're intrinsically political, but they are also politicized. There's clearly a lawfare strategy going on against Donald Trump that has political motive. But that is undeniable. Donald Trump is involved in literally thousands of legal cases. There is a complete Wikipedia entry devoted to all the legal cases that involve Donald Trump. Most of those, not all of them, obviously some of them purely, as a routine element of business. But it's not just that. Most of this is related to his presidency, and most of this indeed came about after he left office. The most famous one is probably the one you currently see on the screen. Donald Trump is now the first former president who is a convicted felon. So he has been charged with 34 felonies, and he was recently found guilty. Now, the sentencing is delayed. I wish I could have told you he was sentenced last week, because that was the original idea, but it's been postponed. Then there are other cases. He lost a civil suit that was related to fraud charges that is currently appealed. He lost a case related to defamation charges that is currently being appealed. He is being charged related to the mishandling of classified documents. That is being postponed. And another one that is postponed has to do with racketeering related to conspiracy charges in terms of the elections. This is typically the way it is reported in the news. That is, on the one hand, to the left, Trump guilty on all counts. This is a very strong title, because technically it's true, but it is guilty on all counts in one legal proceeding. But it says guilty on all counts. It's like he cannot be saved, So this is clearly coming from opponents, right? But then on the other hand, you have somebody saying the high price of Democrats' anti-Trump lawfare. So this statement clearly implies that this lawfare, it's not just politically motivated, it comes from the Democrats. And then it makes the additional argument, which is actually sociologically interesting, that this might backfire. What I would like to argue is, how is it related to political issues? This is very interesting, and I would think specific to the United States. This is the prosecutor who was involved in the 34 felony counts that Trump was held guilty on. This is an elected official. This is not an appointed official. This is a Democrat. So Alvin Bragg, he is currently very heavily criticized in New York, and he's presently heavily criticized because while he's going after Trump, he's not going after a lot of other crimes. Another person is Letitia James. She was in charge with the fraudulence report. She herself is now being sued. So they're suing the people that are suing. Jack Smith, he is the one in charge with the classified documents case. Now, Jack Smith is clearly an attorney, an independent, he's actually an international law expert, but he was appointed by the Secretary General of Joe Biden. So now they're trying to say it's all political, not because Jack Smith is political, but the person who appointed him. And finally, this is Fani Willis. She is the prosecutor in terms of the January 6th election attempt, and she is also being criticized severely now. Most of these trials will not go on. Why? Because the Supreme Court has recently ruled on the immunity of the President of the United States. This has been decided in July 1. This is a very big issue in the United States currently. So the Supreme Court is the highest court of the land, and it recently ruled that, I have to be careful about the wording, that the President of the United States has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. So it doesn't say that the president is absolutely immune from anything he does officially, but from anything he does officially within the constitutional bounds. And otherwise, he has presumptive immunity, and obviously from non-official issues, he has no immunity at all. So this case was quite a watershed moment. And as you know, the elections are coming up in November, so presumably nothing will happen for a little while, at least not until the election. Then the second case that I talk about is about democracy and the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. As you may know, academics have largely been quiet after October 7th, which I thought was very striking because it was, after all, a fairly important event, a terrorist event or a violent event, but it was fairly quiet. Some people, of course, didn't fail to express their, pleasure, if you will, over what happened. Norman Finkelstein is one person. He's a person who's been very controversial in the United States because he wrote a book on the so-called Holocaust industry. It's somewhat exceptional. He is very anti-Israel, very anti-Zionist, but he's of Jewish descent. He has attracted quite a large following, and particularly among young people. So it's a fairly problem. He was denied tenure some years ago, and he's kind of become a little bit of a cult figure among younger people. Other people have also been fairly blatant about it, say, resistance is the only answer. So they have articulated the October 7 events as a justified resistance. Harvard had immediately after the October 7 attacks, not later, but immediately after attacks, issued a statement that Israel was responsible for the violence. Some people, like Lawrence Summers is the former president of Harvard, immediately came out in opposition and said, this is disgraceful, and the silence of scholars and of faculty is disgraceful as well. These are pictures that I took. This is in New York City. One of the things that started to happen after October 7th was the kidnapped posters, so these are the people from Israel that were being kidnapped. Then what also happened, see, these posters, other people have written on top of them, do you see it? And it says, Free Palestine, FU. So you see this kind of popular conflict taking place. This is also in New York, this is in Central Park. Every Sunday, at around 10 or 11 in the morning, there is a gathering to release the hostages that goes under the banner of Bring Them Home. Now, New York is also the place where you have most of the protests against Israel taking place. And here you see the Palestinian flags. This is on the campus of Columbia University, obviously before this was closed down. These are some pictures that I took. So you have people chanting, in this case, in favor of Palestine. And then you have other people moving in that are on the other side. This is what Columbia University looks like. So this is the entrance to a university in the United States today. So it's all barricaded and you cannot get in anymore. Then there's also a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism. This was at a meeting that I attended in New York. Here you see this is actually one of my neighbors, and he's hanging up posters. Now what I want to tell you is this. Maybe you've heard of this. There were hearings in Congress in the United States about this anti-Semitism. And what are presidents doing about it? And as you will know, 2 presidents of colleges have stepped down. However, this political issue is not all that is going on. Here you see several examples of lawfare. Jewish student sues Columbia. Columbia student sues after being forced from a program. University of Pennsylvania faces a lawsuit. 10 Jewish students file lawsuits against Cooper Union. And then Columbia University faces a wave of litigation. So you see, the law is being invoked. The law is being used as a weapon, not by the powerful, but by students, by the least powerful of all. So I think this is a very important dimension of this entire democratic discussions. This is actually one of the colleagues at Columbia who's been very vocal about this issue. So he has been under investigation by his university, but he is in turn also suing his university. So again, a lot of legal activity going on. Finally, my somewhat intellectual hero, Jürgen Habermas, you may know, wrote a statement of solidarity, a principle of solidarity, which is a very modest, short statement that basically says, no matter whatever critique you may have of Israel, and no matter whatever critique you may have of what Israel doing in the war against Hamas, we should at least not resort to anti-Semitism. That's all he said. Well, that was too much, because nowadays he's being condemned as a Nazi. So now there are, like, you know, certain people, right? So what I would say, I'll wrap it up, is that indeed, that you see how law is being democratized itself. Anybody can use law. Not just the powerful, not just the rich. You're in a democracy. Students can do it too. Of course, students do it with some support from organizations, but it's nonetheless as individuals. These are not class action lawsuits, by the way, right? So they do it as an, and what you see is that ultimately this is all a cultural event. And then finally, the argument that I make is that obviously we cannot return to, let's say, one set of cultural values because of cultural pluralism, but I would also argue that not all cultural value systems are compatible with democratic norms. In the case of the anti-Semitism on university campuses, for instance, the university protesters were not met with any sanctions until the point that they started committing crimes, and until the point that it turned to violence. So there's obviously a limit to what can be done. Thank you very much. This is thank you in Korean. And FYI, I am presently editing a book on democracy and law called Democracy, Governance and Law. This book will be available in the spring of 2025. The authors write from all kinds of perspectives about all kinds of issues having to do with law and democracy. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.